Welcome to the next lesson of our tutorial series on how to create the game StackColors in Unity. For this lesson we're going to be creating the finish line and the stack launch mechanic. For the finish line you'll want to start with another empty game object, so you'll click the plus sign, select create empty. I've renamed mine to finish line. You'll then want to add a box glider component to this object and make it a trigger by enabling the isTrigger option. At this point we want to add the line for the finish line. So I'm going to right click on the finish line, go down to 3D object and select quad. The transform for this object is set to 0.3 in the Y position and 90 in the X rotation. I've then set the material for the mesh render component to the pickup material so that it's white. At this point we can go back to the parent object and we can change the scale of both the box collider and our quad by scaling up this parent object. And so I have the X scale set to 10 so that it spans the full width of my platform, and I've scaled down the Z to 0.25 so that it's just a thin white line. Next you'll want to set the tag of this object to finish line end and the layer to ignore raycast. We can then duplicate this object and make the duplicate a child to the first. Then rename this object to finish line start, and now all we have to do is change the tag to finish line start, and you want to set the Z position to -85. Alright, now there's one more thing that we need to do before we go on to the code, and that is set the position of the finish line. And you want to set it at the end of your platform. So my platform is scaled to 100 in the Z axis, and so I can put the finish line at the position of 100 on the Z axis. This will put the second finish line at the end of our platform and the first finish line a little bit further in. To code the interaction between our player and these finish lines, we can open up our player controller script. In our player controller script, we first need to add some new variables. The first is a bool called @end. The next three are float variables, which I've made serialized fields. The first one is called forward force. The next one is called force adder, and the third is called force reducer. And the last variable that we need to create is a public static action. And in order to have actions, you need to include using system up at the top. The action will have a send type of float, and we'll call it kick. Once we have all these variables, we can then scroll down to our Ontriggerenter function. Inside our Ontriggerenter function, we first want to check to see if our player object has entered the first finish line. So I have if other.tag equals finish line start. We then want to set our @end variable equal to true. We can then create an if statement to see if we've crossed the second finish line. So I have if other.tag equals finish line end. Inside this if statement, we first want to set our velocity to 0. So I have my rb.velocity equals vector3.0. We can then set our isPlane variable equal to false. This will make it so that our player object stops as soon as it crosses the second finish line. And finally, we want to call a new function, which I've called launchStack. Now we'll create this function in a second, but we first want to add one more if statement where we're checking to see if @end equals true. If it does, then we just want to return, so that there's no way to do the rest of the code inside this function. Now let's go ahead and create the launchStack function. Now this is a void function with no parameters, and it's pretty simple. The first thing that we want to do is set the target of our camera follow script. So I have camera.main.get component, and we're looking for the camera StackColor script. We can then call the setTarget function, and we'll pass in the parent pickup. Now the reason why I set it to the parent pickup object is because that's the object that's on top of our stack. And so when we launch our stack, it's most likely that the top object will go the farthest. And so I want our camera to follow that object. After this line of code, we want to send our action event. And so I'm calling the kick action, and I'm passing in the forward force variable. Now before we handle the other end of this action, let's add the rest of the code that we need for this script, and that is found up in our update function. Inside our update function, we want to handle the variable force of our launch. To do this, we first want to check to see if we've crossed the first finish line. And so I have if @end is true, and then inside this if statement, we want to reduce our forward force. So I have forward force minus equals force reducer times time.delta time. We can then make sure that our forward force doesn't go below 0, and so if forward force is less than 0, we'll just set forward force equal to 0. Next we want to handle the increase of our forward force, And so I have if input.get mouse button down, and I'm passing in a 0 for the left mouse button. We then need to check to make sure that we've crossed the finish line. So if at end is true, we'll then do forward force plus equals force adder. This will add a certain amount to our forward force variable every time the player clicks the left mouse button. Now the last thing that we need to do for this script is to not allow the player to move the player object when we're inside the finish line. So inside our other if statement, checking for the player's input, we want to add if at end is true and return. This will make it so that we never call the move sideways function if we're inside the finish line. Once you have all this, we can save this script, and we'll need to go over to our pickup script. Inside this script, if you haven't already, we need to add two new variables, which are both serialized fields. The first is a rigid body called pickup RB, and the second is a collider called pickup collider. We then need to subscribe this script to our kick action, and this is done inside the onEnable function, where we're calling the player controller StackColor class. We're then accessing the static kick action. We then need a plus equals and a new function name which I've called myKick. We also want to make sure that we're unsubscribing to this action, so you can actually copy your onEnable function, paste it in, change it from onEnable to onDisable, and change the plus equals to a minus equals. After which we need to create the myKick function. This is a private void function called myKick, and it has a parameter of type float because that's the send type of our action, and I've called the parameter force sent. Now having this set up makes it so that each pickup object will receive a force value from our player controller script when we call the launch stack function. And we call our launch stack function when we cross the second finish line. And so in our myKick function, we first want to dechild this pickup object from our player object. And so we just call transform.parent equals null, which will make each pickup object in our stack its own object. We can then re-enable the collider of our pickup. So I have pickup collider.enabled equals true. We'll then disable isKinematic on our rigid body. So I have pickup RB.isKinematic equals false. And finally, we'll add a force to our pickup. So I have pickup RB.addForce, and I'm passing in a new vector 3. The X parameter is 0, the Y parameter is 200, and the Z parameter is our force sent parameter. Once you have all that, we can save this script and we'll go back to Unity. Inside Unity, we first want to select our player object, where we need to set the force adder variable to something like 10 and the force reducer to something like 2. We can then select our pickup prefab, and you'll just need to make sure that you drag in the rigid body to the pickup RB variable and the collider of the child object to the pickup collider. After which we can now test our project. So I'm going to left click, which will start our player moving forward. And we've seen all of this. But now when I cross the first finish line, if I spam the left mouse button, when I reach the second finish line, it launches our stack. And if I do it again, but this time I don't spam the left click, you can see that the add force is just straight up, which we might actually not want. To fix that, you could just change this 200 to force sent as well. So we'll test it one more time. I think that looks a lot better. Hey, thanks for watching to the end of this video. If you enjoyed this lesson, make sure that you give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel so you can be up to date with all our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.